I'm Daniel Harper, 42 years old, and the first thing that made me uneasy wasn't something I saw. It was something I heard, and then didn't. Laura is 39. We've been married 11 years. Long enough that you stop noticing routines until they change. Long enough that you can tell who's home just by the sound of a car door closing outside. Her car has a loose heat shield that rattles when she turns off the engine. Always has. I'd hear it most nights around 6:15. I never looked at the clock on purpose. My body just knew. One night, I heard the car at 8:02. That alone didn't mean anything. Work runs late. Traffic happens. What bothered me was that she didn't come inside. I was at the sink rinsing a plate. The engine cut off. The rattle. The door opened. Closed. Then nothing. No footsteps. No keys. I waited longer than I want to admit before I walked to the front window. Laura was still sitting in the driver's seat. The dashboard light washed her face in blue. Her shoulders were angled forward, elbows resting on the steering wheel, phone held close. She smiled at the screen. Not a big smile. Just the kind that sneaks up on you when you're comfortable. I stepped back before she could see me. By the time she came in, I was drying the same plate for the second time. Sorry, she said, slipping off her shoes. I was finishing an email. Late night, I said. Yeah. She kissed my cheek. Quick. Distracted. Her jacket smelled like cold air and something sharper underneath. Not perfume. Just unfamiliar. Dinner was quiet in the way long marriages often are. Not tense. Just efficient. She told me about a meeting that ran long. I told her about a client who couldn't decide what he wanted. We ate. We cleaned up. Afterward, she showered. Long one. I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone without really reading anything. When she came out, hair damp, she didn't sit next to me. She picked up her laptop and said she had one more thing to wrap up. I went to bed alone. That night, I dreamed our house was almost the same, but not quite. Cabinets in the wrong place. A door where there shouldn't be one. I woke up with that dull pressure behind my eyes that means you didn't really rest. The next few days were normal enough to make me doubt myself. Laura laughed at my jokes. Asked about my meetings. Folded laundry while watching TV and tossed me my socks the way she always did. If I'd been looking for proof, I wouldn't have found any. But the sound of her car stuck with me. After that night, she started sitting in it more often. Not every evening. Just often enough to register. Sometimes she came straight inside. Sometimes she stayed a few minutes. Always on her phone. I didn't mention it. I didn't want to become the guy who monitors arrival times like a security system. Instead, I noticed smaller things. She started taking her phone into the bathroom. Always placing it face down on the counter if she left it anywhere else. Notifications stopped lighting up the screen. I assumed she'd changed a setting. That was reasonable. What wasn't reasonable was the way she angled the screen away from me without realizing she was doing it. One Saturday morning, we were both in the kitchen. I was making coffee. She was leaning against the counter scrolling. She smiled and let out a quiet breath through her nose, like something had amused her privately. What's funny? I asked. Nothing, she said, too quickly. Then, after a pause, just something dumb. She didn't show me. That shouldn't have mattered. Couples don't owe each other every thought. But it landed wrong. Like a door gently closing where one hadn't been before. A week later, she said she'd be staying late for a project push. She mentioned it casually, already halfway out of the room. Okay, I said. I ate dinner alone. Watched an episode of a show we'd been watching together and realized halfway through that I didn't care if I spoiled it for her. That feeling surprised me more than the loneliness. She got home just after 9. Same thing again. Car. Pause. Phone glow. This time, I didn't move away from the window. I watched her type. Stop. Smile. Type again. Her face looked younger like that. Less guarded. Like she wasn't carrying anything heavy. When she finally came inside and saw me standing there, something flickered across her expression. Not guilt. Surprise. "Oh," she said. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I replied. "Heard you pull in." "Oh." She glanced back toward the driveway. "Sorry again. Long night." She went straight to the bathroom and locked the door. The fan came on. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to slow my breathing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't panicked. I just felt displaced. Like I'd walked into my own life and found something subtly rearranged. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I checked the phone bill. Not messages. Just usage. Times. Durations. There was a number I didn't recognize. Not saved. No name. Repeated calls. Short ones during the day. Longer ones in the evenings. Almost always ending right before she came home. I memorized the last 4 digits. I didn't write them down. I didn't take screenshots. I didn't want evidence yet. I wanted understanding. That night, Laura fell asleep before me. Her phone sat on the nightstand, face down. I stared at it longer than I should have. Thought about reaching for it. Thought about what that would turn me into. I didn't touch it. Instead, I turned over and faced the wall, listening to her breathing. Even. Calm. That hurt more than anything else. The next morning, she woke up cheerful. Too cheerful. She hummed while getting dressed. Kissed me longer than usual before leaving. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," I replied. I meant it. That was the problem. Later that day, my phone buzzed with a notification from our shared calendar. Something she must have added by mistake and quickly removed. It stayed long enough for me to read. It. Lunch, M. Just the letter. No last name. No context. But I knew then. Not everything. Not the full shape of it. But enough to stop pretending this was nothing. Enough to know that whatever was happening had been happening without me for a while. Somewhere between the sound of her car and that single letter, my marriage had started speaking a language I couldn't ignore anymore. And at 42, I finally understood that listening wasn't the same thing as accusing. It was just paying attention. After the calendar notification, I stopped asking questions I didn't want answered. That might sound backward, but it wasn't avoidance. It was restraint. I didn't want a story shaped by whatever she could explain convincingly in the moment. I wanted to see what remained when I stopped helping her lie. Laura came home that evening at 6:34. Close to normal. Close enough to feel intentional. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down. "You get my calendar thing earlier?" I added it by mistake. "I saw it," I said. "Oh." She paused. "It's just a work lunch." I nodded. "Okay." She waited. For what? I wasn't sure. A follow-up question. Curiosity. Jealousy. When none came, she turned toward the fridge and started listing what we needed from the store. That was when I realized how much of our relationship had been built on my responses. My engagement. My willingness to keep the conversation alive. Without it, things fell flat quickly. Over the next few days, I noticed how often she filled silence with explanation now. Not prompted. Just volunteered. "I might be late tomorrow. Things are hectic at work lately. I don't know why my phone's been acting weird." She was narrating her own alibi. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her timeline. I just listened. At 42, you learn that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think they're managing perception. When they believe they're still ahead of you. The name surfaced again on a Thursday night. We were brushing our teeth side by side. The mirror was fogged just enough to soften everything. She checked her phone and smiled before she could stop herself. "Who's that?" I asked, casually, toothpaste still in my mouth. She froze. Just for a second. No one, she said. Then, too quickly, Mark. From work. There it was. No mystery. No drama. Just a name finally stepping into the room. Marketing. I asked. Yeah, she said. He's on a project with me. I rinsed my mouth and wiped my face, watching her in the mirror instead of turning around. How old is he? I asked. She shrugged. Mid-30s, I think. Mark was 34. I didn't know that yet, but I could already feel the shape of the answer. Young enough to admire her experience. Old enough not to feel like a mistake. I didn't ask anything else. That night, she didn't sit in the car when she got home. She came straight inside, almost like she was correcting a behavior. She laughed louder than usual. Asked about my day with exaggerated interest. Suggested we open a bottle of wine we'd been saving. I declined. Just tired, I said. That phrase had become a shield. A few nights later, she took a call on the back porch. The door was cracked just enough for sound to travel. I didn't mean to listen. But the house was quiet and her voice carried. It wasn't flirtatious. That's what people get wrong. It was familiar. Comfortable. The tone you use when you don't need to impress someone anymore. I know, she said softly. I miss that too. We'll figure it out. When she came back inside and saw me sitting there, her shoulders tightened. Work? I asked. Yeah, she said. Just sorting things out. I nodded. Later that night, when she was asleep, I finally checked the phone bill again. The same number. Longer calls now. Less frequent, but more intentional. Affairs don't always escalate loudly. Sometimes they condense. The following Saturday, we folded laundry together on the bed. A quiet, domestic task. The kind that makes you believe things are stable simply because they're familiar. Laura held up one of my shirts and smiled. You still like this one? She asked. Yeah, I said. She hesitated, then sat down. Do you ever feel like we've just stalled? She asked. There it was. The opening line. I'd heard versions of it before from friends who were already divorced. I folded a towel carefully before answering. I think we stopped talking honestly, I said. Her eyes flicked up to mine. Sharp. Searching. I don't mean you, she said quickly. I mean us. I met her gaze. That's usually what people mean. She looked away. That night, she didn't sleep much. Checked her phone twice. Each time thinking I was asleep. I wasn't. The following week, a meeting of mine got cancelled unexpectedly. I came home early. The house was empty. Her car was gone, even though she'd told me she was working from home that day. She walked in at 6:29, startled to see me. Oh, she said. You're home. So are you, I replied. She set her bag down slowly. I had lunch with Mark, she said. We lost track of time. No denial. No cover story. Just enough truth to test how it would land. How long has this been going on? I asked. She closed her eyes. 3 months. I nodded. And? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Yes, she said finally. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sit down. I just leaned against the counter, feeling the room tilt slightly. I'm not going to argue with you, I said. And I'm not going to compete. She started crying then. Quietly. Apologizing. Explaining. Saying she didn't plan it. That she felt invisible. That she didn't know how it happened. I listened until she ran out of words. I'm going to stay somewhere else, I said. I need space. For how long? She asked. Long enough to remember what peace feels like, I replied. At 42, I knew something I hadn't known at 30. Staying wouldn't save the marriage. It would just cost me myself. I packed that night. When I hugged her goodbye, it wasn't forgiveness. It was closure in its simplest form. I walked out with a bag, my keys, and a strange sense of calm I didn't trust yet, but didn't want to lose. I stayed with my brother the first few nights. He didn't ask many questions. Just cleared a drawer, handed me a spare key, and told me to help myself to whatever was in the fridge. At 42, that kind of quiet support feels heavier than sympathy. The first morning there, I woke up before my alarm. The room was unfamiliar enough that my brain didn't know what to expect. No sounds from the kitchen. No sense of where Laura might be in the house. Just stillness. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window. It tasted fine. That surprised me. I'd expected everything to feel wrong. Laura texted before 9. "Did you sleep okay?" I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I typed back. "Yes." Nothing else. That became the pattern. She sent long messages. Apologies. Explanations that tried to sound reflective instead of defensive. She said she was confused. That she didn't mean to hurt me. That she felt like she'd lost herself somewhere along the way. I didn't argue with any of it. I also didn't engage. I answered practical questions only. Bills. The dogs. Mail. When emotion showed up in her messages, I let it sit unanswered. Not as punishment. As protection. Distance does something conversations can't. It removes performance. After a week, I went back to the house during the day while she was at work. I needed clothes. A couple books. Things that were still mine. The house felt staged. Clean in a way that lacked personality. Like someone had tidied up after a showing. I walked room to room slowly. Not searching. Just noticing. Her side of the closet was already half empty. She'd taken the things she cared about. Left behind what she didn't want to decide about yet. In the kitchen, I found a mug I didn't recognize. Plain white. No chips. No history. It sat alone in the sink. I didn't pick it up. That afternoon, while loading boxes into my car, I saw a man across the street talking on his phone. Mid-30s. Taller than me. Casual clothes. He looked up briefly, then looked away. I knew immediately. Not because of how he looked. Because of how he didn't look again. Mark. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. He nodded once, barely perceptible. I returned it, equally small. There was no anger in me. Just a strange neutrality. He wasn't my problem. He never had been. That night, Laura called. I almost didn't answer. Not because I was afraid of the conversation. Because I didn't want to go backward. I picked up anyway. "I'm not calling to fix things," she said quickly. I don't know how to sit with this." "That's part of it," I replied. Silence. "I ended it," she said. "With Mark." I believed her. It didn't matter. "I'm not asking you to come back," she added. "I just wanted you to know." "Okay," I said. "You sound so calm." "I am calm," I replied. "Calm doesn't mean nothing happened." She exhaled shakily. "Do you hate me?" "No," I said honestly. "I just don't trust you." That landed harder than anger ever could have. We met in person a week later. Neutral place. Quiet cafe. Public enough to keep us both careful. She looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who'd been carrying something heavy and finally set it down too late. She cried. Apologized again. Asked if there was anything she could do. "There isn't," I said. "Not right now." "What about counseling?" "I don't want to process this together," I said. "I need to understand it alone." That was the truth. I didn't want a shared narrative. I wanted clarity. The separation turned into a decision without ceremony. Paperwork. Logistics. Signatures. No theatrics. Friends asked questions. I gave short answers. "We're separating." It wasn't working. I didn't explain further. The people who mattered didn't push. Over time, I noticed something unexpected. I slept better. I ate better. My shoulders didn't feel permanently tight. Loss was there, yes. But so was relief. And that made me uncomfortable at first. One evening, weeks later, I sat alone on the back porch of the house after Laura officially moved out. The dogs lay at my feet. The neighborhood was quiet. I realized I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. Not from her. Not from him. Not from life. What she lost wasn't me being angry. It was me being available. And in that space where I used to explain, excuse, and endure, something steadier took hold. I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact. The house didn't feel empty after Laura left. That surprised me. I'd expected echoes. Rooms that felt too large. Instead, everything felt more defined. Quieter, but clearer. Like a picture that finally came into focus after you adjusted the lens. I started noticing how much energy I used to spend anticipating her moods. Wondering if I should ask something now or wait. Deciding whether a comment would land wrong. That constant low-level awareness was gone, and without it, my days felt longer in a good way. I fell into routines without trying to build them. Up early. Coffee. A run if the weather allowed. I stopped checking my phone constantly. There was no one to explain myself to anymore. At work, I became sharper. Not colder. Just more direct. I stopped cushioning my opinions. People listened more when I spoke. That wasn't a coincidence. Laura reached out occasionally. Not often. Short messages. Practical things at first. Then, slowly, emotional ones began to surface again. I miss how we used to talk. I didn't realize how much I depended on you. I didn't respond to those. Not because they were untrue. Because they arrived too late. One evening, a mutual friend mentioned she'd moved into a smaller apartment across town. That she'd changed jobs. That things hadn't worked out the way she expected. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need the details. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They just settle in. I ran into Mark once more, months later. This time at a hardware store. He was with someone else. Laughing. Comfortable. He saw me, recognized me, and looked away. That confirmed something I already knew. Whatever he'd been to Laura, it wasn't something he'd stayed. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just distance. Late one night, I found an old photo while cleaning out a drawer. Laura and me, years ago, sitting on the floor of the house before we'd fully moved in. Pizza boxes around us. No furniture yet. We looked tired and hopeful in that way only young couples do. I stared at it for a while, then put it back. Not everything needs to be thrown away to be released. I started dating eventually. Slowly. Carefully. I told the truth early. I paid attention to how people handled small moments, discomfort, silence, disagreement. I trusted my instincts without apologizing for them. One woman asked why my marriage ended. It stopped being honest, I said. That was enough. I realized something important during that time. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I'd been afraid of being unseen while pretending I wasn't. That fear was gone now. Laura texted once, months later, asking if I'd be willing to talk again. Not about reconciliation. Just closure. I thought about it. Then declined. I've already said what I needed to say, I replied. I wish you well. That wasn't cold. It was accurate. Some nights, the house is very quiet. The dog's asleep. The light's low. I sit with a book or nothing at all and let the quiet be what it is. I don't replay conversations anymore. I don't imagine alternate endings. I don't wait for something to happen. What happened already did. And what came after was something I didn't expect. Peace. Not the loud kind. Not the kind you post about. The kind that stays even when no one's watching. I don't think about Laura the way I used to. She's not a presence in my daily life anymore. She's more like a reference point. A marker in time. Before and after. Nothing more complicated than that. The house has settled into itself. It creaks in familiar places. The dogs know the rhythm of the day. Morning light hits the kitchen counter the same way it always has, and for the first time in a long while, the consistency feels grounding instead of fragile. I've learned how much I used to excuse without realizing it. Not just her behavior, but my own silence. I confused patience with self-respect. I thought staying calm meant staying quiet. It took losing the marriage to understand the difference. People ask sometimes if I'd do anything differently. If I'd confront sooner. Leave earlier. Fight harder. The truth is, I left when I was ready to leave cleanly. No yelling. No revenge. No need to convince anyone I was right. That mattered to me. I don't carry anger toward Laura. I also don't carry responsibility for her choices. Those things can exist separately. That realization took time, but it stayed once it arrived. Occasionally, I'll hear her name through someone else. An update passed along without intent. She's doing fine. Or she's struggling. Or she's figuring things out. I don't attach myself to those outcomes. What I carry forward instead is attention. The ability to notice when something feels off and not talk myself out of it. The understanding that love doesn't require endurance of dishonesty. That loyalty doesn't ask for self-erasure. At 42, I don't feel hardened. I feel clearer. I know what peace costs now. I know what it's worth. Some evenings, I sit on the back porch and let the quiet settle around me. No expectations. No rehearsed conversations in my head. Just being present in my own life. That's what I kept. Not the marriage. Not the story. Myself. And that turned out to be enough.